Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're undertaking what might be, well, our most challenging and maybe provocative investigation yet. We're delving into the sources surrounding G. Edward Griffin's seminal and, let's face it, highly controversial work, The Creature from Jekyll Island.
Yeah, this is definitely a deep dive we needed to do because, this source material, it really challenges the very definition of the U.S. financial system as most people understand it.
Exactly. So our mission today is to really unpack Griffin's core argument. And that argument is basically that the Federal Reserve System, it wasn't actually created to stabilize the economy or, serve the public interest.
Not at all, according to him. He argues it was a calculated, a very deliberate act of legislative engineering. The goal, to centralize financial power, put it squarely in the hands of a banking elite.
And allow them to manipulate the money supply for their own private profit. Perpetually.
Right. Perpetual private profit. That's the key part of his claim.
That's just a staggering claim, isn't it? Right. Especially when you consider that most of us, well, we're taught to see the Fed as the ultimate guarantor of economic stability. Yeah. The grown-ups in the room, so to speak.
Precisely. Which is why we need to start where Griffin starts, with his opening challenge. The fundamental riddle. What is the Federal Reserve System, really?
He says the textbook answers, the ones we all learn, are fundamentally deceptive.
They are. Griffin argues the name itself is, well, intentionally misleading. First off, it's not actually federal. It's a collection of private corporations.
Private corporations. Not government agencies.
According to his analysis, yes, legally private entities. Second, he says there are technically no reserves in the classic sense, like, a big vault of gold or silver backing up the currency.
Yeah.
And maybe the most startling point, the Federal Reserve banks themselves, those 12 regional branches, they aren't really banks in the way you and I think of banks. They don't serve the public directly. They don't take your deposits like your local bank does.
So if you just strip away that textbook definition, what are we left with? Not this big government institution protecting our assets, but something else entirely.
Something else. Griffin says we can't approach this like it's a lesson from a curriculum. We have to approach it like a mystery that needs solving.
A mystery. Okay. So what emerges when you peel back those layers?
Well, what Griffin presents is an analysis of a structure. A deliberate, predictable, and, he argues, highly profitable structure. A system specifically engineered to transfer wealth and sovereignty. Quietly. Efficiently.
And the engine driving this transfer, the thing that makes it work.
It's inflation. That's the core mechanism he identifies. It guarantees profit for the system's architects, he claims, while hiding the true cost from the public.
So inflation isn't just some unfortunate side effect of economic activity.
Not in Griffin's view. He sees it as deliberately engineered, a permanent hidden tax, a way to siphon off wealth without anyone explicitly voting for it.
Wow. Okay, if that's the end result, let's definitely go back to the beginning. Let's investigate the blueprint. And this is where the story gets, well, almost like a spy novel. The secret history of this cartel.
Right. The creation myth, as Griffin portrays it, is absolutely steeped in secrecy. It takes us back to 1910 to a private rail car headed south. This is the famous or infamous journey to Jekyll Island, Georgia.
And the level of secrecy involved. It really tells you something, doesn't it? About what they thought the public reaction would be if they knew what was being planned.
Absolutely. The details of their travel arrangements, as documented in the sources, they're almost theatrical. You have 7 of the most powerful men in American finance.
Titans of industry and banking.
Exactly. Boarding this private rail car one by one in New Jersey, heading south in December 1910. They were explicitly told, arrive separately, don't eat together in public.
And the names. They had a strict ironclad rule. Yeah. No last names allowed, first names only.
That's right. The source material emphasizes this almost espionage level stuff. You had Frank Vanderlip, who was the president of National City Bank, and Henry P. Davison from J.P. Morgan. They actually used aliases.
Aliases? Like spies?
Pretty much. Wilbur and Orville, like the Wright brothers. It sounds almost comical, but it was deadly serious. It was the perfect cover for a guys planning a financial revolution, right? Keep the press, especially the financial reporters, completely in the dark.
That level of secrecy, it just screams that they were creating something so radically beneficial to them that they knew any kind of open public proposal would be dead on arrival.
Yeah.
Politically impossible.
Precisely. They knew the history. Americans were deeply suspicious of centralized banking power.
So who exactly were these 7 men? And what kind of power did they actually represent?
Oh, the concentration of wealth and power gathered in that rail car was frankly staggering. You had Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was the key political figure, the legislative point man. You had Paul Warburg,
The European banking expert.
Yeah. Yes, from the influential Warburg group in Europe. An absolute expert on central banking over there. And then you had executives tied directly to the massive Morgan and Rockefeller financial empires.
So the biggest players.
The biggest. To give you a sense of scale, Griffin cites a New York Times article from later, 1931, which estimated that the members of the Jekyll Island Club alone, just the club members, not even everyone at this specific meeting, represented something like 1/6 of the total wealth of the world.
1/6 of the world's wealth.
That's the estimate cited. And critically, that number didn't even include the full weight of the Rockefeller interests or the European groups like the Warburgs who were involved in this specific secret meeting.
Good grief. So this wasn't just a meeting of industry leaders. This was the absolute apex of American and maybe even global financial power meeting in total secrecy.
It was the financial aristocracy plotting in private.
Okay, so setting aside the cover story, wasn't it supposed to be a duck hunting trip or something?
Yeah, that was the flimsy excuse.
Right. Setting that aside, what was the real non-negotiable goal of this secret gathering?
The goal, as Griffin frames it, was to engineer what he calls a banker's utopia. See, before 1913, the financial system ran on fractional reserve banking, which, is how banks create money by lending out more than they hold in reserves.
But that system was inherently unstable, wasn't it? Prone to panics.
Extremely prone. You had major panics in 1873, 1884, 1893, and then the really big one, the crisis of 1907, which almost brought the whole system down. That crisis was fresh in their minds.
What exactly was causing these panics? Just banks lending too much?
Essentially, yes. Recklessness. When a bank loaned out way too much money compared to its actual cash reserves, it created this fragile situation. Any sudden demand for cash, a bank run, a panic could push it over the edge into bankruptcy.
But wasn't there a mechanism before the Fed for dealing with those reckless banks?
Right. There was, and this is a crucial point Griffin makes. The pre-1913 system, while messy, did allow weak, over-leveraged banks to fail. When their more conservative competitors demanded settlement in actual cash, the reckless ones couldn't pay up and they went under.
So failure was possible. It was a kind of harsh market-based discipline.
A very harsh one, yes. But it served as a check on the system. The failure of individual banks, while painful, could prevent systemic rot.
Okay, so the goal at Jekyll Island wasn't to get rid of fractional reserve banking itself, because that's how they make money, right? Lending out created money.
Exactly. They didn't want to stop doing that.
They wanted to eliminate the risk associated with it. For them, they needed centralization, some kind of backstop to make sure that when things went wrong, the consequences wouldn't fall on them. The losses needed to be shared, or even better, pushed onto someone else entirely.
That's precisely it. They wanted an institutional safety net, a system where if a commercial bank got loaned up, as they say, meaning its cash reserves were basically gone, there would always be a central institution ready to step in, cover its debts, and pump new liquidity, new money into the system.
Which would insulate the bank owners from the consequences of their own risky behavior.
Completely. Socialize the risk, privatize the profit. That's the core principle Griffin identifies.
But wait, didn't you say Americans hated the idea of a central bank? Like the Bank of England? The whole idea was politically toxic back then, wasn't it?
Absolutely toxic. Decades of political battles had been fought over it. The memory of Andrew Jackson fighting the Second Bank of the United States was still potent. The words central bank were poison in 1910.
So how on earth did they manage to achieve centralization, which they needed, without triggering that massive political backlash?
Well, this is where the real genius, or perhaps the cunning of the plan comes in. They engineered an incredibly clever disguise. Political reality demanded concealment.
So they couldn't call it a central bank.
Definitely not. They decided they had to establish a cartel, a private agreement between the major banks that would function like a central bank, but they had to give it a name that sounded, well, governmental, public-spirited.
And that's how they landed on the Federal Reserve System.
Yes.
Federal Reserve System. Each word carefully chosen.
Each word designed to mislead, according to Griffin. Federal suggests government control. Reserve suggests safety and backing. system suggests a decentralized structure, not a single powerful central entity.
And that illusion of decentralization, the 12 regional branches spread across the country, that was the key selling point, right? To convince people, especially out west and in the south, that Wall Street wouldn't just dominate the whole thing.
It was absolutely essential window dressing. It created the appearance of regional control, of diffusing power away from New York.
But in reality,
the control mechanisms remained highly centralized. Power resided with the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, appointed by the president, but heavily influenced by the banking sector, and critically with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York,
which just happened to be located right in the heart of Wall Street's power structure.
Strategically placed, yes. It became the operational center, the most powerful of the regional banks by far.
Okay, let's talk about the mechanics, the actual engine under the hood. You mentioned Paul Warburg was the key intellectual force.
He really was the dominant mind at Jekyll Island, often called the father of the system. Warburg, coming from that European banking dynasty, he knew the European central bank models inside and out, especially the German Reichsbank.
And his big contribution was figuring out how the new currency, the Federal Reserve notes, would actually be created.
That was his crucial insight. How do you create an elastic currency, one that can expand and contract, but keep control in the hands of the bankers? His solution, drawing from the German example, was ingenious. Banks could create currency based primarily on commercial paper.
Commercial paper, you mean IOUs from corporations? Business debt?
Exactly. Debt. Money creation was directly tied to the expansion of commercial and corporate debt.
Wow. So the more businesses borrowed, the more money could be created.
Correct. This gave the banking cartel unprecedented control over the flow of credit and the money supply. It essentially bound the expansion of the nation's money directly to the expansion of corporate debt, which of course paid interest back to the banks issuing the loans.
This is where the political sleight of hand seems almost perfect. Because at the time, you had genuine reformers, progressives, who honestly believed they needed some kind of government intervention to control the big banks, the so-called money trust.
They absolutely did. There was real public anger about the power of Wall Street after the 1907 panic. People wanted reform.
And the Jekyll Island plan was presented as that reform, as the government finally stepping in to harness the money trust, force Wall Street to act responsibly.
That was the public narrative. But Griffin's research, and the research of others he cites, suggests the exact opposite happened.
It wasn't a harness, it was a protective shield.
It was an insurance policy. The reforms enacted in 1913 didn't actually dismantle the money trust or reduce its power. They stabilized it. They gave it a government-sanctioned, bulletproof structure that protected it from the very panics that used to threaten its existence.
So Wall Street didn't lose control.
They gained insulation. The slow diffusion of financial power away from New York that had actually been happening in the decades before 1913, that stopped. Wall Street maintained and arguably enhanced its dominant position, all under the comforting guise of serving the public interest.
So wrapping up this part, the conclusion from Griffin's perspective is stark. The Federal Reserve System isn't what it appears to be. It's a legal, private monopoly of the money supply operated for the benefit of the few under the guise of protecting and promoting the public interest.
That quote sums up his argument perfectly. It was, as Paul Warburg's own biographer apparently described it, a quiet revolution, conducted by, quote, probably the mildest-mannered man that ever personally conducted a revolution.
A revolution achieved not with guns, but with complex legislation and deceptive language. A bloodless coup.
Accomplished entirely through institutional design.
Okay, so we've got the structure. A protected private cartel disguised as a public institution. Now we need to really dig into the core mechanics. How does this cartel actually make its money and exert its control? This brings us to what Griffin colorfully calls the Mandrake mechanism.
Right, the Mandrake mechanism. But before we get to that specific Fed trick, we need to quickly revisit the foundation it builds upon. Fractional reserve banking. That's the base layer.
Remind us quickly how that works.
Sure. It's simply the system where commercial banks, your everyday banks, are allowed to operate with, as Griffin puts it, an incredibly thin layer of cash compared to the total amount of money they promise to pay out on demand to depositors.
So they only keep a fraction of deposits on hand.
Exactly. And the money they create through lending, it's kind of a hybrid. Part of it might historically have been linked to some vast majority, especially today, is essentially fiat money, created out of thin air, just an entry on a ledger when they make a loan.
And the incentive for the bank is obvious, right? They earn interest only on the money they lend out, the money they create, not on cash sitting idle in a vault.
Absolutely, which creates this powerful inherent temptation. Griffin calls it almost a natural law within that system. Lend out as much as possible. Maximize loans, maximize interest income. Prudence, keeping large reserves, is actually punished financially. Recklessness, lending to the hilt, is rewarded.
Up to the point where you whisk a bank run, which is what the Fed system was designed to prevent, as we discussed.
Precisely. It removes that ultimate consequence, allowing the lending impulse to run much freer.
Okay, so that's the commercial bank level. The Mandrake mechanism, though, that's the Federal Reserve's specific accounting trick, the one that supercharges this whole process by converting government debt directly into money. Walk us through how that works, because it really does sound like creating something from nothing.
It essentially is, from Griffin's perspective. The whole function of this mechanism is to convert debt into money. It usually starts when the government, specifically Congress, decides to spend more money than it collects in taxes, which happens, well, pretty often.
Understatement of the year. So they issue bonds, government IOUs, to cover the deficit.
Right. They try to sell these bonds to the public, to foreign governments, to institutions. But what happens if there aren't enough buyers for all the debt Congress wants to issue?
Does the Fed step in?
That's exactly when the Fed steps in. The Federal Reserve becomes the buyer of last resort for government debt. It purchases those unsold treasury bonds.
Okay, but where does the Fed get the money to buy those bonds? Does it have some giant fund sitting around?
That's the magic trick, the Mandrake mechanism. The Fed doesn't use existing money. It creates the money on the spot. It essentially writes a check to the U.S. Treasury for the bonds, drawing on, well, nothing.
It just writes a check.
It writes a check or makes an electronic bookkeeping entry. Fiat dollars are created instantaneously right then and there, with no prior savings, no gold backing, no actual deposit behind them. They literally fabricate the currency needed to buy the government's debt.
Wow. Okay, so the government gets the cash it needs to spend without Congress having to raise taxes directly, which is always unpopular. And this newly created money enters the economy as the government spends it.
Correct. That's the first wave of new fiat currency entering the system. But that's only step one of the Mandrake mechanism's power.
There's more. How does that initial creation get multiplied? You mentioned something like a 9x leverage.
Yes. This is where the fractional reserve system at the commercial bank level kicks back in, supercharged by the Fed's actions. Here's how it works. The Fed now holds those government bonds it just bought. It classifies these bonds on its own books as assets.
Okay.
Now, the money the Fed created to buy those bonds eventually gets spent by the government, and it ends up being deposited into various commercial banks throughout the economy. For the commercial banking system as a whole, these new deposits represent reserves.
Reserves flowing in from the Fed's money creation.
Exactly. And what do banks do with new reserves?
They lend them out. Or rather, they lend out multiple of them.
Precisely. Under the fractional reserve rules set by the Fed itself, banks only need to keep a small fraction, say 10% of deposits as reserves. So if a bank receives, let's say, $100 in new reserves originating from that Fed bond purchase, it doesn't just sit on it. It can immediately lend out roughly $90 of that $100.
Creating $90 of new money in the process through the loan.
Correct. Then the person or business who borrows that $90 spends it, and it gets deposited in another bank. That second bank now has $90 in new reserves. It keeps 10%, $9, and lends out the rest, $81.
And that $81 gets deposited, and the next bank lends out 90% of that. It's a chain reaction.
It's a multiplier effect. That initial $100 created by the Fed out of thin air to buy the government bond doesn't just add $100 to the money supply. Through this fractional reserve lending cascade, it ultimately supports creation of potentially up to $1,000 in new money circulating in the economy.
So for every dollar the Fed creates directly to monetize government debt, the commercial banking system, the cartel members get to create about $9 additional through loans.
That's the approximate leverage Griffin describes. And the beauty of it for the cartel is that they collect interest on all of this newly created money, the initial amount and the multiplied amount, money that cost them essentially nothing to produce. It's interest on manufactured credit.
It really does sound like a perpetual motion machine fueled by debt. Which leads to a really fundamental point Griffin makes. If our entire money supply is ultimately based on debt, government debt, corporate debt, mortgage debt, credit card debt, what would happen if Hypothetically, everyone actually managed to pay off all their debts.
It's a mind-bending implication. If, theoretically, every single debt in the economy, national, corporate, consumer, all of it, were somehow fully repaid, Griffin argues the entire money supply would simply vanish.
Vanish. Poof, poof.
It would cease to exist.
Sure.
Because the money is the debt. It was created as an interest-bearing loan, a promise to pay. If the promise is fulfilled and the debt extinguished, the corresponding money disappears from the ledgers. It dissolves back into the nothingness from which it was summoned.
So our money isn't really a store of value in the traditional sense. It's a representation of outstanding debt.
That's his core argument. It has no intrinsic value. Its existence is predicated on perpetual indebtedness. In this sense, he argues quite profoundly, our money is created out of less than nothing. It's created out of an obligation, a liability that must constantly be serviced with interest.
And this system doesn't just tolerate debt. It seems to actively encourage it, even when loans go bad. You mentioned the way banks handle defaults.
Right. This gets into the usury aspect, as Griffin sees it. When a borrower can't make their payments and defaults on a loan, what's the bank's incentive? Writing off that loan as a loss hurts the bank's balance sheet, reduces its assets, and potentially exposes how thinly capitalized, how leveraged it really is.
So they want to avoid writing it off at all costs.
At all costs. So what do they often do instead? They extend and pretend, they roll over the loan. Often they'll even increase the size of the loan, lending the borrower more money.
But wait, if the borrower couldn't even afford the interest payments on the original loan, how can they possibly afford payments on a larger loan?
They can't, not initially. And here's the truly perverse part of the mechanism. The bank will often create additional new money out of nothing, specifically to lend to that distressed borrower.
They lend them new fake money.
Essentially, yes. This new loan isn't for productive purposes. It's designed specifically to allow the borrower to make the interest payments on the original defaulted loan, plus, of course, the interest payments on the new rescue loan.
That is ingenious in a terrifying way. It turns what looks like a loss, a disaster for the bank, a non-performing asset, into what looks like a win on their books.
Exactly. It converts a potential loss into an increased asset, a larger loan receivable, and generates higher future interest payments because the total debt is now bigger. The fiction of solvency is maintained, the bank looks healthier on paper, and the debt burden on the borrower just gets heavier and heavier.
It's completely unsustainable for the borrower, but it's a guaranteed, ever-increasing stream of income for the bank, all based on manufactured money and ever-compounding debt.
It perpetuates the debt instrument and maximizes interest collection, regardless of the actual health or productivity of the underlying borrower or the economy. It rewards financial engineering over real economic value creation.
Okay, so the Mandrake mechanism ensures the banks profit handsomely when things are going well, when debt is expanding. But we established earlier that fractional reserve banking, by its nature, encourages risk-taking and is inherently unstable. Bubbles form, bubbles burst.
Yeah.
What happens when the inevitable downturn hits? What protects the cartel from the consequences of its own potential recklessness?
Now we get to the absolute core reason for the Federal Reserve's existence, according to Griffin's thesis. It's the built-in insurance policy, the ultimate backstop. The primary objective, he argues, wasn't just profit, but the socialization of risk.
Socialization of risk, meaning what exactly?
Meaning getting the government involved as the official agent for shifting the inevitable losses, the losses that will occur in a fractional reserve system away from the bank owners and on to somebody else.
And that somebody else is?
The taxpayers. You and me. The goal was to legally guarantee that even if the banks made catastrophic lending decisions, engaged in wild speculation and blew themselves up, they wouldn't ultimately bear the financial consequences. The public would. This is what Griffin calls the game called bailout.
They needed a system where they could gamble, keep the winnings, but have someone else cover the losses.
That's the essence of it. And the historical record, what Griffin calls the bailout scorecard, seems to provide pretty compelling evidence that this mechanism isn't just theoretical, it's been used consistently throughout the Fed's history.
Okay, let's look at some of those key moments he highlights, starting with the Penn Central Railroad crisis back in 1970. What happened there?
Penn Central, which was then the largest railroad in the U.S., was failing spectacularly, just hemorrhaging money. This was a huge problem because major U.S. banks, including giants like Chase Manhattan, held massive loans to Penn Central.
So if the railroad went bankrupt,
the banks would have faced crippling losses on those loans. It could have triggered a wider financial panic. So what happened? Congress responded almost immediately. They authorized $125 million in federal loan guarantees to Penn Central.
Loan guarantees, meaning the government promised to pay the banks back if the railroad couldn't.
Exactly. They didn't really save the railroad in the long run. It still ended up in bankruptcy reorganization. What they saved were the banks that had lent recklessly to the railroad. The federal government stepped in, using taxpayer backing, to ensure the creditors, the banks, were protected from their bad decision.
And Griffin points out something else controversial about that episode, doesn't he? Something about insider trading.
He does. He cites reports and investigations suggesting that Chase Manhattan's own trust department dumped over 250,000 shares of Penn Central stock just before the railroad's catastrophic financial situation became public knowledge.
So they potentially used inside information to save themselves from stock losses, while the government was simultaneously arranging a bailout to protect their loan losses, all ultimately backed by the taxpayer.
That's the allegation Griffin presents. It paints a picture where the insiders protect themselves while positioning the public to absorb the fallout. The narrative is always protecting the system or preventing collapse, but the immediate effect is protecting the large financial institutions.
Okay, that's Penn Central. Fast forward less than a decade to 1979, and we have the crisis at First Pennsylvania Bank, or First Penn.
Right. First Penn was the nation's oldest bank, a venerable institution, but it got itself into deep trouble, became technically insolvent.
What did they do?
Massive high-risk speculation in the government bond market. They made huge bets on interest rates, and the bets went badly wrong. Their losses from these speculative activities actually exceeded the entire value of their stockholders' investment. In simple terms, they were broke.
So under the old pre-Fed system,
they would have been toast. Liquidated. Their depositors might have been protected to some extent by early forms of deposit insurance, but the bank owners and shareholders would have been wiped out. That was the market discipline.
But this is the Fed era. Liquidation is not the preferred option for large connected institutions.
Not at all. First Penn was deemed too big to fail. Even back then, it was saved. How? The FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, whose funds ultimately come from assessments on banks but are implicitly backed by taxpayers, stepped in, and a consortium of other large banks also provided funds.
But what was the Fed's role?
Crucially, the entire rescue package was underpinned by a promise from the Federal Reserve. The Fed committed to buying certain securities related to the bailout, essentially signaling it would provide unlimited liquidity if needed. It put the Fed's money creation power behind the rescue.
So again, losses generated by risky, speculative behavior by the bank's management were effectively covered by taxpayer-backed funds, the FDIC, and the Fed's ability to create money. Socialization of loss, plain and simple.
A textbook example, according to Griffin.
But maybe the most critical test case, the one that really showed the system's true colors, was Continental, Illinois in 1982. This seems like the moment the too-big-to-fail doctrine became undeniable.
Oh, absolutely. Continental, Illinois was huge, the seventh largest bank in the U.S. at the time, and it failed spectacularly, just imploded.
Why? More bad loans.
Yes, a combination of very risky loans, particularly in the energy sector through its relationship with the failed Penn Square Bank, and just general mismanagement. And then it got hit by the modern form of a bank run, an electronic bank run.
Money being pulled out by wire transfer.
At lightning speed. Large institutional depositors got nervous and started withdrawing billions of dollars electronically. The bank simply couldn't meet the outflow. It was collapsing in real time.
And the regulators realized...
The FDIC did the math and realized something terrifying. If Continental, Illinois was allowed to completely fail and default on all its obligations, the scale of the losses would completely wipe out the entire Federal Deposit Insurance Fund. The fund built to protect depositors nationwide would be gone, evaporated by the failure of just one reckless bank.
Wow. So the failure of one bank could potentially cascade, destroying confidence in the entire banking system and wiping out the insurance meant to protect average depositors in other banks.
Exactly. That was the systemic risk they faced. Protecting the system, therefore, meant they had to abandon the old principle of letting even large, weak institutions fail. They had to intervene on an unprecedented scale.
And what did they do? It was more than just loans, wasn't it?
Much more. The FDIC essentially took over the bank. They assumed $4.5 billion worth of bad loans from Continental, Illinois' books. They effectively nationalized the bank, injecting capital and taking 80% ownership of its stock, though they avoided using the word nationalization.
And the Federal Reserve's role in this monster bailout?
Absolutely critical. Because the potential losses were so vast, far exceeding the FDIC's resources, the Fed had to be intimately involved. Why? Because, as Griffin relentlessly points out, the Fed possesses the unique, extraordinary power required in these situations. The ability to manufacture whatever amount of money might be necessary to cover the losses of the cartel.
It comes back to the Mandrake mechanism, the ability to create money out of thin air.
Always. The Fed stood ready to provide unlimited lines of credit, to buy assets, to do whatever it took to ensure the rescue didn't fail due to lack of funds. It performed its ultimate function as the lender of last resort.
Lender of last resort. That's the official term. But Griffin has a different interpretation of what that really means, doesn't he? He equates it to the hidden tax machine.
That is the absolute crux of his critique. When the Fed acts as a lender of last resort, creating potentially billions or even trillions of dollars out of nothing to bail out failing institutions within the cartel, where does that money ultimately come from? It doesn't just appear without consequence.
It dilutes the value of all the existing money.
Precisely. Every new dollar created by the Fed to cover losses reduces the purchasing power of every dollar already in circulation, held by savers, workers, pensioners. This transfer of wealth, this dilution, is eventually extracted from the entire population through the mechanism we keep coming back to, the hidden tax called inflation.
So the bailouts aren't free. The cost is just hidden, spread out over everyone over time through rising prices.
Exactly. And Griffin argues this wasn't an unforeseen consequence. It was precisely the reason the system was created, to ensure that the inevitable costs and losses generated by a risk-prone fractional reserve banking system managed by a private cartel would ultimately be borne by the public through inflation, while the profits generated during the boom times remained private. It's structurally designed, he claims, to confiscate wealth from savers and transfer it to the issuers of credit and the beneficiaries of bailouts.
All right, so we've mapped out the structure, this private cartel idea. We've looked at the mechanics, a Mandrake mechanism creating money from debt, and we've seen the insurance policy, the bailouts funded by inflation. Now let's turn to what Griffin argues are the long-term consequences of this entire system for the average person. The erosion of sound money and ultimately personal liberty.
Yeah, this is where the impact really hits home for individuals. Griffin draws a sharp contrast between the fiat money system we have now, managed by the Fed, and what he calls sound money historically, that meant gold and silver.
Why sound money? What's the key difference?
The key difference is discipline. With sound money, the money supply is constrained by a scarce physical resource. Governments and banks can't just create it out of thin air whenever they want. This physical constraint, he argues, naturally leads to long-term price stability, provided there isn't excessive government interference or manipulation.
Whereas with fiat money,
there are no inherent limits. The supply can be expanded infinitely at the discretion of the central bank, usually to accommodate government spending or bail out the financial system. Griffin argues the period since the Fed's creation in 1913 provides devastating proof of fiat money's effects.
Okay, let's look at the data point you mentioned earlier, the one that really caught my attention, this illusion of prosperity. Between 1913, when the Fed was created, and 1990, which is the period Griffin analyzed in detail, the average annual wage in the U.S. apparently skyrocketed by something like 3,233%.
Right. On paper, that looks like an absolute economic miracle, doesn't it? Your paycheck is 30 times bigger. You must be 30 times richer.
It certainly sounds like it, but that's the illusion.
That's the illusion perpetuated by the shrinking value of the currency itself, according to Griffin. He says, okay, your paycheck got much bigger in nominal dollar terms, but the crucial question is, what could those dollars actually buy? How much did your real purchasing power increase?
And how did he measure that?
He adjusted those nominal wage gains using the price of gold as a constant measuring stick. Now, using gold as a benchmark is itself controversial, but his argument is that gold represents a more stable, less manipulable measure of value over long periods compared to a constantly inflating fiat currency.
So when you adjust for the change in the dollar's value relative to gold over those 77 years, what was the real increase in purchasing power?
It was just 73%.
Wait, not 3,233%, but only 73% over nearly 8 decades.
Exactly, which averages out to less than 1% real growth in purchasing power per year.
Good heavens. So that massive increase in the dollar amount on the paycheck was almost entirely eaten up by the decline in the value of each dollar. It was essentially meaningless in terms of real wealth gains from the monetary system itself.
That's Griffin's point. People were forced to run faster and faster, earn more and more dollars, just to stay in roughly the same economic place. The steady, systematic erosion of the dollar's value meant your savings were constantly losing purchasing power, your fixed income became worth less each year.
So where did the actual improvements in living standards come from during the 20th century? We obviously live better now than in 1913.
Overwhelmingly from technological innovation, increased productivity, capital investment, the real economy stuff. Not, he argues, from the magic of the fiat monetary system. The fiat system, in his view, acted more like a hidden brake, constantly confiscating a portion of those real gains through inflation.
And perhaps the biggest, most expensive consequence hidden by this fiat money system is its ability to finance massive government undertakings, particularly war.
Yes, this connects the Mandrake mechanism directly to the funding of the modern warfare state. Before fiat money and central banking, governments typically had to rely on direct taxation or explicit borrowing from the public to fund wars. Both are politically difficult.
Raising taxes is unpopular and borrowing has limits.
Exactly. Fiat money, created by the central bank buying government debt, provides a third way. It allows the government to fund enormous expenditures, like wars, without imposing immediate, unpopular direct taxes or facing the limits of the public bond market.
The true cost is hidden, deferred, paid by everyone through inflation later on.
Precisely. It makes large-scale, prolonged warfare much easier to finance politically. Griffin uses World War I as a prime example of this mechanism in action shortly after the Fed's creation.
What happened during WWI?
During the main period of U.S. involvement in financing, roughly 1915 to 1920, the U.S. money supply almost doubled. It jumped from about $20.6 billion to nearly $39.8 billion. This massive infusion of new money was largely created via the Fed buying government war bonds.
And the consequence for the average American?
Massive inflation. Griffin calculates that Americans effectively paid about 1/2 of every dollar they owned or earned to the government through the hidden tax of inflation during those 5 years. Their purchasing power was cut in half. And remember, that was on top of the direct taxes like the newly introduced income tax that they were also paying to fund the war effort.
So a hidden 50% tax via inflation plus direct taxes.
Right.
While the banks
who were facilitating this process through the Federal Reserve System they designed collected enormous amounts of interest on the staggering levels of government debt created by the Mandrake mechanism specifically to finance the conflict. War became incredibly profitable for the financial sector.
This power to create money, fund governments, finance wars, manage crises, it inevitably leads to a concentration of power, not just domestically, but on a global scale, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Griffin argues that the same forces pushing for financial centralization within the U.S. were also operating internationally. He traces the next major evolution of this system to the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944.
Where the IMF and the World Bank were created.
Exactly. He views these institutions not as benign organizations for global development, but as the embryonic stages of a future world central bank and a global lending agency designed to extend the same principles of centralized financial control and debt-based currency to the entire planet.
And the ideology behind these institutions at their founding, was it purely about stable exchange rates?
Not according to the sources Griffin analyzes. He argues that the conference saw significant influence from individuals and groups who believed strongly in international socialism and centralized planning people like Harry Dexter White, a key U.S. Treasury official later accused of spying for the Soviet Union, and John Maynard Keynes, whose economic theories inherently favor government intervention and management.
And a key goal for many attendees, aligned with the banking interests, was to move away from gold entirely.
Absolutely. The ultimate goal for many proponents of this new global architecture was to eventually eliminate gold backing for currencies altogether. Why? Because gold imposes discipline. It limits the ability of governments and central banks to inflate indefinitely. Removing the gold constraint was seen as necessary to achieve unlimited money creation capacity for a future world currency or system, giving a global authority ultimate control over the economic and political life of every nation.
And in the meantime, with the U.S. dollar established as the world's primary reserve currency after Bretton Woods, what role does the Federal Reserve play in this international game today?
The Fed effectively acts as the global lender of last resort through its relationship with the IMF, the World Bank, and other central banks. It channels U.S. dollars and dollar-denominated credit across the globe.
often to regimes in countries that aren't exactly paragons of democracy or free markets.
Very often. Griffin argues this isn't about humanitarian aid or promoting democracy. He claims it's done primarily to gain leverage and control over the political leaders of those nations. By making foreign governments dependent on a steady flow of sweet cash loans and aid originating from international agencies heavily influenced by the U.S. and its financial system, the cartel, as he sees it, can exert political pressure and accelerate convergence towards a more centralized global political and economic structure, a new world order, as he explicitly calls it.
So the international loans and aid are essentially a strategic debt trap, designed to buy influence and ultimately sovereignty.
That's his interpretation. The unique status of the U.S. dollar as the world reserve currency gives the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government an unparalleled tool for projecting power. The ability to create dollars seemingly without limit allows the U.S. to finance its own massive trade deficits and exert international financial influence that no other nation can replicate.
Griffin also points out a kind of paradox in this system, doesn't he, regarding funding potential adversaries?
He does. He highlights the long history of Western finance and technology being transferred, often via loans facilitated by the system, to regimes like the Soviet Union during the Cold War and more recently to China. He argues this isn't accidental, but systemic.
How so? Why fund your geopolitical rivals?
Because, he argues, this continuous funding and building up of potential adversaries ensures the need for perpetual military readiness and massive defense spending by the West, particularly the U.S. And perpetual military spending means perpetual government borrowing.
Which means perpetual profits for the banking cartel via the Mandrake mechanism financing that debt.
Exactly. It creates a self-perpetuating cycle. Instability and potential conflict abroad justify massive government debt at home, which enriches the financial system that controls the creation of money and credit. It's a system, in his view, that structurally benefits from and even fosters the very global tensions it claims to be protecting against.
It needs the crises to justify its own existence and profitability.
It's a deeply cynical view, but that's the structure he describes. A self-feeding mechanism designed for maximum control and profit, operating under the radar of most citizens.
Well, this has certainly been a deep dive. We've journeyed through G. Edward Griffin's challenging perspective on the Federal Reserve, really trying to unpack his core arguments. We've explored the idea of the Fed not as a public servant, but as a legally protected private cartel.
We've looked at the mechanics he describes, particularly that Mandrake mechanism, the almost alchemical process of turning government debt into fiat money and private interest income for the banks.
And we've examined the consequences. The system of perpetual hidden taxation through inflation and the safety net of taxpayer-funded bailouts that socialize the risks of the financial system while keeping the profits private.
And it's crucial to reiterate Griffin's own framing. He presents this not as some shadowy conspiracy theory based on speculation, but as an analysis of a documented structure based on historical records, legislative acts, and the public statements of the key players themselves.
The ultimate conclusion he draws is a profound challenge to our understanding of economic freedom and governance. He argues that true economic liberty simply cannot coexist with a system where the power to create money is completely divorced from market discipline, taken away from the people, and concentrated in the hands of a few unelected individuals operating largely in secret.
Right. When money itself becomes fundamentally an instrument of debt created out of nothing by a privileged cartel, he argues that sovereignty inevitably shifts. It moves away from the citizens, the governed, and towards the financial and political elites who control the levers of credit creation and distribution.
So to leave you, our listener, with a final thought to chew on, something Griffin emphasizes powerfully. He reminds us that the founding fathers of the United States had a deeply bitter, firsthand, crippling experience with worthless fiat paper money. The Continental currency during the Revolutionary War practically defined worthlessness.
Not worth a Continental.
Exactly. And because of that searing experience, they specifically wrote the Constitution to prohibit both the states and the federal government from issuing paper money, bills of credit, or making anything other than gold and silver coin legal tender for the payment of debts.
That constitutional prohibition seems pretty clear historically.
It does. So the provocative question Griffin leaves us with is this. If the Constitution was so fundamentally designed by people with such bitter experience to prevent the very existence of fiat money and centralized banking power, how did we end up with a system where a central bank, the ultimate issuer of unbacked fiat currency, became not just accepted, but viewed as an indispensable, unchallengeable pillar of the entire modern American economy?
Well, that's about all the time we have. You've been listening to The Deep Dive from Wake Up and Smell the Freedom, where ideas percolate. Thanks for joining us as we continue to explore the ideas that shape liberty and continue to shape us today. Remember, the pursuit of liberty begins with understanding, and understanding begins with asking the right questions. Until next time.
Bye-bye.